Good morning, boys and girls. Before we go on to Chapter 9, let's take a minute to discuss our answers for Chapter 8, make sure that we're all on the same page. So the first question that I posed to you was, why do the rats find Gregor amusing? And if you look with me on page 84, the rats are actually, I think, enchanted with Gregor because he is speaking to them. If you look, it says, to his surprise, Fanger and Shed laughed. He speaks, said Shred. What a treat. Usually we get nothing but shrieks and whimpers. And then Gregor goes on to say to him, well, I thought you might like to get to know your meal better. So they're in awe of the fact that a human, knowing that he's going to be eaten by these rats, are talking to him, and in such a very casual manner. Then when things get a little crazy in this chapter, the question is, when the rats are dying, they tell him, we are going to hunt you to the last rat. Meaning that it doesn't matter how many rats it's going to take, they will get Gregor and kill him if it's by the very last rat. And then in the very end, we see a lot of slaughtering going on. There's a lot of blood and gore with the bats coming in. Vicus and Marith and trying to think of her name now, Lucas. And they're coming into that cave and trying to save Gregor and Boots, and they burn everything. And they burn it because they do not want any trace and they don't want any smell. And at the beginning of the chapter, we learn that Gregor knew why the Underlanders were bathing him all the time. It's because the rats can smell even those little bits of green. All right, we're on to Chapter 9. There will be some questions after this chapter, so make sure that you previewed those. All right, Gregor watched the water flash under his eyes as he clung to the bat. For a moment, he felt relieved to have escaped the rats, but the fear of hurtling through the air on a wounded back quickly overcame him. Boots had her arms clasped so tightly around his neck that he could barely breathe, let alone speak. And what would he say to Marith anyway? Wow, I'm really sorry about that whole thing back on the beach. He had no idea, of course, about the rats, but hadn't the Underlanders tried to warn him? No, they had spoken of danger, but no one had specifically mentioned rats except the cockroaches. Rat bad, one had said, and later they had talked about how much the rats would pay to bargain with Luxa. He and Boots could have been sold to the rats, and then what? He felt nauseous and shut his eyes to block out the churning water. The image of the carnage on the beach filled his head, and he decided the view of the water was better. It turned to blackness as the light from the fire diminished. When light flickered off the waves again, he knew they were nearing Regalia. A group of Underlanders waited on the dock. They whisked the unconscious Perdita and her bleeding bat away. They tried to take Marith on a stretcher, but he brushed them off and insisted on helping to carry his bat inside. Gregor sat on the dock where Marith had shoved him as they landed, wishing he could disappear. Boots was quiet now, but he could feel her little muscles were rigid with fear. 15, 20 minutes passed maybe. He couldn't tell. Up! Someone snarled at him, and he saw Marith glaring down at him. The gash on his forehead was bandaged, the right side of his face bruised and swollen. Find your feet, Overlander, Marith barked. Had he actually thought this guy was shy a few hours ago? Gregor slowly straightened his stiff legs and stood. Marith tightly tied his hands behind his back. No question about it this time. He was definitely a prisoner. And you know what, boys and girls? Rightly so. The rats could have killed all of them, couldn't they? Another guard joined Marith, and they marched Gregor ahead of them. His legs moved numbly. What would they do to him now? He paid no attention to where they were going. He just walked whatever way he was pushed. He had a vague sense of climbing a lot of stairs before he entered a large diamond-shaped room. There was a table in the middle of it. Marith pushed him down on a stool by a roaring fireplace. The two guards stepped back a couple of paces, watching him like hawks. I'm that dangerous? He thought foggily. Boots began to stir on his back. She tugged on one of his ears. Home, she pleaded. Go home, Gigo. Gregor had no answer for her. People were hurrying past the door, talking in excited voices. Some peered in at him, but no one came in. In the warmth of the fire, he realized he was frozen. He was soaked in river water up to his waist and shivering from the wind and the horror of what he'd witnessed, of what he'd taken part in. Boots was in better condition. Her backpack seemed to be waterproof, and she was pressed up against him. Still, her toes felt like ice when they brushed his arm. Fatigue watched over Gregor, and he wished he could lie down, just lie down and fall asleep and wake up in his bed where he could see the car lights flashing across the walls. But he had given up thinking this was a dream. What had happened to the Underlanders? Perdita, her wounded bat, and Marith? If they died, it would be his fault. He wouldn't even try to argue that. Just then, Luxa appeared, burning white with fury. She crossed the room and struck him on the face. His head snapped to the side, and Boots let out a cry. "No hitting!" she squeaked. No hitting!" She shook her tiny index finger at Luxa. Hitting was absolutely forbidden in Gregor's house, and it had only taken Boots a few timeouts to realize it. Apparently, it wasn't acceptable among the Underlanders either, because Gregor heard Vicus's voice ring out sharply from the doorway. "Luxa!" Looking like she'd love to slap him again, Luxa stalked to the mantel and glared into the fire. "For shame, Luxa," Vicus said, crossing to her. She turned on him, spitting venom. "2 flyers are down, and we cannot awaken Perdita because the Overlander must escape? Strike him? I say we throw him into the dead land and let him take his chances," shouted Luxa. "Be that it may, Luxa, this is not seemly," said Vicus. But Gregor could see the news had upset him. "Both rats are dead?" he asked. "Dead and in the river," said Luxa. "We scorched the land." "This matter of we, you and I shall take up later," said Vicus severely. "The council is not pleased." "I care not what pleases the council," muttered Luxa, but she avoided Vicus's gaze. So, she wasn't supposed to be there, thought Gregor. She's in trouble too. He wished he could enjoy the moment, but he was too racked with worry, guilt, and exhaustion to care. Besides, Luxa had saved his life taking out Shed. He owed her one, he guessed, but he was still stinging from the slap, so he didn't bring it up. "No hitting," said Boots again, and Vicus turned to him. Like Luxa, Gregor was unable to meet his eyes. "What did the Overlander, Luxa? Fight or flee?" asked Vicus. "Henry says he fought," Luxa admitted grudgingly, "but without skill or knowledge of weapons." Gregor felt like saying, "Hey, all I had was a stupid torch, but why bother?" "Then he has much courage," said Vicus. "Courage without caution makes for early death, or so you tell me daily," said Luxa. "So I tell you, and do you hear?" said Vicus, raising his eyebrows. "You hear not, as he hears not. You are both very young for deafness. Unleash his hands and leave us," he said to the guards. Gregor felt a blade cut through the ropes on his wrists. He rubbed the marks, trying to restore circulation to his hands. His cheek throbbed, but he wouldn't give Luxa the satisfaction of seeing him touch it. Boots reached over his shoulder and touched the creases on his wrists. "Ow," she whimpered. "Ow." "I'm okay, Boots," he said, but she just shook her head. "Gather us here," said Vicus, sitting at the table. Neither Gregor nor Luxa moved. "Gather us here, for we must discuss," said Vicus, slapping his hand on the stone surface. This time they both took seats as far from each other as possible. Gregor pulled Boots up over his head and out of the backpack. She settled on his lap, wrapping Gregor's arms tightly around her and looking at Vicus and Luxa with large, solemn eyes. "I guess after tonight, Boots won't think the whole world is her friend," thought Gregor. She had to find out sometime, but it still made him sad. Vicus began. "Gregor the Overlander, there is much you do not understand. You do not speak, but your face speaks for you. You are worried. You are angered. You believe you were right to flee those who kept you against your will, but feel sorely that we have suffered in your saving. We told you not of the rats, yet Luxa blames you for our losses. We seem to be your enemy, and yet we gave you time." Gregor didn't answer. He thought that pretty much summed things up, except for the fact that Luxa had hit him. Vicus read his mind. Luxa should not have struck you, but your fight invited horrible death to those she loved. This is greatly felt by her, as both her parents were killed by rats. Luxa gasped, That is not his affair! She looked so distressed that Gregor almost objected as well. Whatever she'd done to him, this wasn't his business. But I make it so, Luxa, as I have cause to believe that Gregor may himself lack a father, continued Vicus. Now it was Gregor's turn to look shocked. How do you know that? I do not know for sure. I only guess. Tell me, Gregor the Overlander, recognize you this? Vicus reached in his cloak and pulled something out. It was a metal ring. Several keys dangled from it, but it was the roughly braided loop of red, black, and blue leather that made Gregor's heart stop. He had woven it himself during crafts class at the very same summer camp that Lizzie was at now. You could make 3 things: a bracelet, a bookmark, or a keychain. Gregor had picked the keychain. His father never went anywhere without it. So that ends chapter 9. Part 2 is titled The Quest. So we're getting into the heart of the book. And it seems like Gregor's dad did end up down in the Underland. So I'm hoping that you're all thinking, what became of Gregor's father? Is he alive? Is he with the rats? Did the rats eat him? Who knows? All right, do well on the questions. Make sure you remember to date in your margin today's date. Make sure you have chapter 8, and make sure you do use my sentence starters. And we'll talk about the questions later. Have fun.